How's everybody enjoying the evening so far? Cool.
Cool, thanks. Sweet. Kia ora koutou, how you doing? Thanks, Paul, that was very cool. That was very cool. Mine's going to be quite a bit drier than Paul's one, because it's about kind of the politics of now, which is a bit more hardcore. But I'm Metiria, I'm one of the Green Party MPs. I was first elected to Parliament in 2002. I was a candidate for the ALCP in 1996 when we first stood for Parliament. It was kind of, we were at sort of like the top end, I think, of a wave of movement and growth in the cannabis law reform movement. We got 1.7% of the vote, which was a significant amount at the time, but disappointing for us all because we had done so much research into the community views and felt that 5% really was within our grasp. It wasn't, and having been now a member of Parliament for a 5% party, a party that can only get into Parliament with 5%, I'm much more aware of how difficult it is to reach that threshold. And am one of the advocates for reducing it, which would be quite helpful. But it was a really good experience, and I'm glad the ALCP is still around doing that work. But I will have some comments to make about voting issues a bit later on. This is just a really brief overview of the things I want to talk about. Some of the policy development history. I found a paper when I was doing research for this talk that was written 10 years ago by Sally Caswell and Sally Abel. Sally Caswell is a very well-known health researcher in New Zealand, very well respected. It's a paper called Cannabis in New Zealand Policy and Prospects. It's not a very big one, but it was a very interesting discussion. They wrote it in 1998, and it was about policy development through the 90s. From 1975, but through the 90s in detail. And what it showed was a deliberate political policy, to avoid any real analysis of the impacts of prohibition on the community. And part of it came through in the absolute refusal to consider alcohol and tobacco alongside cannabis in the policy development process. And there were waves of it that happened through the 90s. This makes it impossible then to have a consistent drug policy if you don't consider those three together. They're the three most popular drugs. There's some research, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute, where that says that about 80% of the population, of the adult population, has tried cannabis and has tried alcohol. So they're very similar usage stats for those drugs. At round about just before 1990 and 89, there was a major liberalisation of alcohol. The 1989 Act, it reduced the age limit from 20 to 18, but it also meant that you could buy alcohol in dairies and in supermarkets, made licensing much, much easier to get. It was part of that neoliberal approach that was sort of so prevalent at the time. Massive liberalisation of the alcohol industry. It was very lucrative for them. There was a ministerial committee set up in 1990 to look at drug policy, and that resulted in a recommendation that legal and illegal drug policy should be separated, and separated at the national level, because although for treatment purposes and dealing with harms, it was more useful to consider those drugs together, for prevention enforcement purposes, it was better to consider them apart because of the different legal status. So that was what they did. They decided to pull them apart and deal with alcohol and tobacco separately from cannabis. There's a whole lot of issues around the body that was supposed to do that work, which was supposed to provide really good analysis of cannabis drug policy. That body wasn't ever established, it just didn't exist. So that work, a lot of that work wasn't done. In 1994, there was another attempt to try to combine the legal and illegal drug policies together. And at that time, the government did advocate for the development of a single national drug policy. And there was a paper that was sent out for public consultation, and there were submissions we sought from the public and analysed, and then another paper was sent to Cabinet. But at Cabinet, again, there was a decision to split alcohol and tobacco policy from cannabis policy. And it was thought then, and I think after I get a lot of lobbying from the alcohol industry, that the alcohol industry played a major part in the decision to keep splitting apart these policy developments. There was a submission from DB that said, linking the illicit consumption of beer, wine and spirits and its associated benefits with illicit drug use is unacceptable. The key group, which was an umbrella group for a number of organisations within the alcohol and hospitality industries, objected to alcohol being labelled as a drug. And they said, the description of beer, wine and spirits as drugs is inappropriate. These goods are lawfully marketed, and the key group takes a strong objection to this linkage between legal and illegal drugs. So there was this, that's just two examples. Behind the scenes, the alcohol industry would have been ferocious in its lobbying of members of parliament and of cabinet ministers at that time. Eventually there was a policy released in 96, but it was very late in 96, and 96 was an election year. So part 2 of that policy, which was the bit about cannabis, was contracted out to a consultant to rewrite it. And in that rewriting, they eliminated the policy objective to look at the cost effectiveness of enforcing legislation for personal use. That was a policy objective. It was taken out during the election year. And following the election, despite further attempts to try to get this policy objective, that you had to look at the cost effectiveness of prohibition and its impacts on the community, the final draft eliminated that policy objective completely from the proposals. Now this is just I just wanted to tell you about this because it's a snapshot of how policy development works, and over a number of years. This was what, 8 years, 7 or 8 years of policy development that got nowhere, that was just stalled and picked and unpicked, cobbled together, had industry involved with it. It was completely useless and largely a waste of time. The objection to looking at cannabis and alcohol and tobacco policies together, I think it continues today, and I think it's a real barrier to any real, consistent, sensible, rational drug policy, because it stops us from being able to look at the reality of cannabis use compared to those other drugs, and in terms of the harm that is caused to a community or an individual from a range of drug use. You just push the button, there we go. These are just some comparisons I pulled up out of research from David Ferguson's work, from the Drug Foundation and from ALAC. 80% of the population have tried cannabis, 69% stop using it. So actually the whole issue around addiction type questions and things becomes a little blurry when the majority of people who try it don't continue to use it for very long. The latest numbers I had was 14,500 arrests. That there may be information that's more up to date about that, and of course the lethal dose, which is kind of hysterical. But 81% of people had drunken alcohol. About 75 to 90% of the crime is associated with alcohol use, and 1,000 people die a year from alcohol consumption. Estimated, that's Alex figures. And actually I was at a Drug Foundation roundtable discussion that they had recently on drugs, on cannabis in particular, but drugs in general. And there were scientists, they brought scientists over from the UK, and they had others here in New Zealand who had been developing new classification systems. Because of course we have the Misuse of Drugs Act, where we have classes A to D now, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, and systems for classifying drugs. And these new systems, they specifically included alcohol and tobacco in their new classification system, so that they could have a sense of where all these drugs fitted, from LSD and methamphetamine and all the a whole lot of drugs I've never heard of. This made no sense. Alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, a whole lot of stuff. Alcohol and tobacco tends to be at the top end of the most dangerous. Not always the most dangerous, especially tobacco didn't always come out on top as causing the most harm. Tobacco tends to be somewhere in the middle or towards the bottom third. Cannabis towards the bottom third.